3 years ago, I tested the nitrogen content of a garden bed I had been feeding with nothing but fermented weed liquid for one full season. The reading came back at a level equivalent to what you would expect from a premium commercial fertilizer application. That bed produced 47 pounds of tomatoes from just 6 plants, in soil that 2 years earlier was pale, aight, calcium-depleted clay that could barely grow dandelions. I had spent $0 on amendments. Zero. And the only input was a 5-gallon bucket of weeds I pulled from the edges of my own property, soaked in water, and left to rot. Now here is what caught my attention. My neighbors on either side of me were spending $300 to $400 a year on bagged fertilizer, soil amendments, and compost deliveries. Their yields were half of mine. Their soil was not improving year over year the way mine was. They were feeding their plants. I was feeding my soil, and that distinction, that one shift in thinking, came from a method I traced directly back to Amish farming communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they have been quietly turning roadside weeds into what they call weed tea for generations. Today I am going to walk you through exactly how to make this weed tea, how to apply it, and why it transforms even the most exhausted dirt into rich, dark, living soil in a single growing season. I will give you the exact ratios, the timing, the species of weeds that work best and the ones to avoid, and the science that explains why this works at a biological level. And stay with me to the end because I will share a secondary fermentation technique the Amish use that almost nobody outside those communities knows about, one that turns this already powerful tea into something that can replace nearly every soil amendment in your garden shed. Now let me be honest with you, for the first 20 years of my gardening life, I treated weeds the same way everyone else does. I pulled them, cursed them, bagged them, and sent them to the landfill. If you have been doing that, you are not alone. I was right there with you, spending good money on fertilizer while literally throwing away the most potent free fertilizer that exists. I composted kitchen scraps. I bought bags of manure. I even tried those liquid seaweed extracts that cost a small fortune. And every spring I would look at my pale, compacted soil and wonder why it never seemed to get any better. Then about 7 years ago I came across a reference in an out-of-print agricultural extension pamphlet from 1943. It described Amish farmers in southeastern Pennsylvania maintaining soil fertility on the same plots for over 200 years without purchasing a single commercial input. That stopped me cold. 200 years of continuous cultivation on the same ground with no decline in productivity. I had to understand how. Here is what I uncovered, and it changed everything. The Amish did not invent weed tea. They inherited a version of it from German-speaking farming communities that brought fermented plant feeding techniques to Pennsylvania in the 1700s. But the practice itself goes back much further. In the Rhineland region of what is now Germany, medieval farming records from the 1200s describe a process called Joche, which roughly translates to liquid manure but actually referred to fermented plant slurry used to restore exhausted grain fields. These were not wealthy landowners experimenting for fun. These were tenant farmers facing famine if their yields dropped. They had limited land, no access to animal manure because the lord of the estate kept the livestock. And they needed maximum output from minimum resources, so they fermented the one thing they had in unlimited supply: weeds. What those medieval farmers figured out through necessity, and what the Amish preserved through practice, is that when you soak green plant material in water and let anaerobic bacteria break it down, the resulting liquid contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a spectrum of micronutrients in a form that soil biology can immediately access. Modern soil science has confirmed this. Research out of Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, published in 2014, showed that fermented plant extracts applied weekly increased soil microbial biomass by up to 60% within a single growing season. That microbial activity is the engine that turns dead dirt into living soil. And the Amish have been running that engine for centuries without ever reading a study. So how do you actually make this? Let me walk you through the entire process from harvest to application. Here's what you need to understand before you pull your first weed. Not all weeds are created equal, and the ones you choose determine the nutrient profile of your finished tea. The Amish prioritize 3 categories. First, deep-rooted weeds like dandelion, dock, and chicory. These plants send taproots down 12 to 36 inches into the subsoil, mining calcium, potassium, iron, and trace minerals that shallow-rooted garden plants can never reach. When you ferment those leaves and roots, you are extracting minerals from deep earth and delivering them to your topsoil. Second, nitrogen-fixing weeds like clover, vetch, and wild alfalfa. These plants harbor rhizobium bacteria on their roots that convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available forms. When fermented, they release that stored nitrogen into your tea. Third, biomass weeds like lamb's quarters, nettles, and pigweed. These fast-growing plants accumulate enormous amounts of nutrients in their tissues. Stinging nettle in particular is remarkable. Analysis published by the University of Minnesota Extension showed that nettle tissue contains roughly 3% nitrogen, 0.5% phosphorus, and 3.4% potassium on a dry weight basis. That is comparable to many commercial fertilizer blends. Now here is a critical point. Avoid any weed that has gone to seed. You are fermenting, not composting. The temperatures in this process will not kill viable seeds, and you will end up planting weeds across your entire garden with every application. Harvest your weeds when they are green, vigorous, and before they flower, if possible. Also avoid weeds from roadsides that may have been sprayed with herbicides, and never use poison ivy, poison oak, or any plant you cannot positively identify. Now let me show you exactly how to build your first batch. You need a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, and that is essentially it for equipment. Fill the bucket roughly 2/3 full with your chopped weed material. I say chopped because cutting or tearing the plant material into pieces about 2 to 4 inches long dramatically increases surface area and speeds up fermentation. Do not pack it down. You want it loose so water can circulate around all the plant tissue. Fill the remaining space with water, leaving about 2 inches of headroom at the top. If you are on municipal water that contains chlorine, fill your bucket and let it sit uncovered for 24 hours before adding your weeds. Chlorine kills the very bacteria you need for fermentation. Well water or collected rainwater can be used immediately. Place the lid on loosely. Do not seal it tight. This fermentation produces gases, and a sealed bucket can build pressure. Some people drill a small hole in the lid. I just set it on top without snapping it down. Place the bucket in a spot that gets some warmth but stays out of direct midday sun. Against the south side of a shed or garage is ideal. The target temperature range for good fermentation is 65 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Here is where the waiting begins and where most people make their first mistake. You need to stir this mixture once every day. Just take a stick or an old broom handle and agitate it for 30 seconds. This introduces small amounts of oxygen that prevent the fermentation from going fully anaerobic, which would produce hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell that makes your neighbors file complaints. A daily stir keeps it in the sweet spot, breaking down efficiently while staying manageable. Why does this daily stirring matter so much? Because you are cultivating a specific community of bacteria. The organisms that break down plant cellulose and release bound nutrients thrive in a microaerobic environment, meaning very low oxygen but not zero. That single daily stir is the difference between a nutrient-rich garden amendment and a foul-smelling mess that even the flies avoid. After 7 to 14 days, depending on temperature, your tea is ready. You will know by 3 signs. The color will have shifted from greenish-brown to a deep, dark brown, almost black. The plant material will have largely disintegrated into a soft mush, and the smell will have changed from sharp and pungent to something earthier, almost like forest floor after rain. If it still smells aggressively sour or sulfurous, give it another 3 to 4 days with continued daily stirring. Now this next part is where most people go wrong, and it is where the real science of the Amish method separates itself from the casual advice you find online. You must dilute before applying. The concentrated tea straight from the bucket is far too strong for direct use. It will burn plant roots and can actually suppress soil biology rather than boost it. The Amish ratio, and this has been validated by soil tests I have run myself over 6 growing seasons, is 1 part tea to 10 parts water. Measure it out. 1 quart of tea into 2.5 gallons of water. Or, if you are working at scale, 1 gallon of tea into a 10-gallon watering can. If you have been finding this useful, take a moment to subscribe. I put out a new deep dive on methods like this every week, and most of what I share never makes it into mainstream gardening advice. All right, let us keep going. Now here is where the application method makes all the difference, and this is something I wish someone had told me years ago. You are not watering your plants with this. You are feeding your soil. That distinction matters because it changes how, where, and when you apply it. Pour the diluted tea directly onto the soil surface, not on the leaves, not on the stems. Aim for the root zone, roughly 6 to 12 inches out from the base of each plant. The goal is to deliver those nutrients and microorganisms directly to the rhizosphere, the thin zone of soil immediately surrounding plant roots, where 90% of nutrient exchange happens. Research from Oregon State University has shown that soil drenching with biological amendments is up to 4 times more effective at building microbial populations than foliar application. Apply in the early morning or late evening when the soil is cool and moist. Never apply in the heat of the day. The ultraviolet radiation from direct sunlight kills beneficial bacteria on contact, and the heat causes rapid evaporation before the tea can soak in. I learned this the hard way my second year. I was applying in the afternoon and wondering why I was not seeing results. Shifted to early morning application and the difference showed within 2 weeks. For frequency, the Amish standard is once every 7 to 10 days during the active growing season. Start applying 2 weeks after transplanting or when direct seeded plants have their second set of true leaves. Continue through the season until about 3 weeks before your first expected frost date. In United States Department of Agriculture zones 3 through 5, that typically means mid-May through early September. In zones 6 through 8, you can often start in April and continue into October. In zones 9 and 10, you can apply nearly year-round, though you may want to reduce frequency during the hottest summer months when soil biology naturally slows. Now let me address something that rarely gets discussed. What happens to the leftover solids at the bottom of the bucket after you strain out the liquid? Do not throw them away. This is the second harvest from your weeds. That thick, broken-down sludge is essentially a concentrated biological inoculant. Spread it directly around the base of heavy feeding plants like tomatoes, squash, peppers, and corn. Work it gently into the top inch of soil with your fingers. It will continue releasing nutrients for weeks and introduces a massive dose of beneficial fungi and bacteria directly into the root zone. I tested this approach on 2 identical raised beds 3 seasons ago. Same soil, same seed, same sun exposure. One bed got the tea application only, the other got the tea plus the solid residue worked into the soil surface. The bed with the solids produced 23% more tomato. Wait by the end of the season. That is a meaningful difference from something most people toss into the compost bin, or worse, the trash. Here is another piece that connects back to why this method has been overlooked. When commercial fertilizer became widely available after World War II, Extension services across America began actively discouraging homemade soil amendments. The reasoning was standardization. You cannot put a guaranteed analysis label on a bucket of fermented weeds. But the Amish never adopted commercial fertilizer in the first place. Their religious and cultural commitment to self-sufficiency meant they kept practicing what worked, generation after generation, while the rest of American agriculture moved toward purchased inputs. By the 1970s, the knowledge of fermented plant feeding had essentially vanished from mainstream gardening education. It survived only in closed communities that had no reason to abandon it. Now let me walk you through the most common mistakes I see people make with this method because I made every single one of them myself. The first pattern is using too high a concentration. I see gardeners online bragging about applying straight, undiluted weed tea to their plants. They show pictures of huge green growth and call it proof. What they do not show you is what happens 6 weeks later when salt buildup from overly concentrated organic acids starts damaging root systems and repelling earthworms. The 1 to 10 dilution is not a suggestion, it is a biological threshold. Below that ratio, you are feeding soil life. Above it, you are suppressing it. I killed an entire bed of peppers in 2019 by applying at a 1-to-3 ratio because I thought more was better. It is not. The second pattern is making the tea without any stirring and letting it go fully anaerobic. You end up with a putrid, sulfurous liquid that smells like raw sewage. Some people apply it anyway, thinking the nutrients are still there. The nutrients are there, but so are anaerobic bacteria that can introduce pathogens to your soil and repel the beneficial aerobic organisms your garden depends on. That daily stir is the difference between medicine and poison. The third pattern is applying the tea to dry soil. If your soil surface is dry and cracked, the liquid runs off or channels straight down without spreading through the root zone. Always water your garden lightly before applying weed tea. You want the soil damp so the tea can wick horizontally through the soil matrix. Think of it like putting dye on a damp sponge versus a dry one. The damp sponge spreads the color evenly. The dry sponge just gets a spot in the center. The fourth pattern, and this is the one that connects to the larger story of why this knowledge disappeared, is believing that soil fertility has to be purchased. Every bag of fertilizer, every bottle of liquid amendment, every truckload of compost represents a transaction. The industrial gardening supply chain, which has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States alone, depends on you believing that the raw materials for soil fertility do not already exist on your property. The Amish never bought that premise, literally or figuratively, and their soil, after 200 years of continuous cultivation, is darker, deeper, and more productive than almost anything you will find on a modern suburban lot. Now, I promised you something at the beginning of this video, and it is time to deliver. The secondary fermentation technique. Here is what I uncovered from studying Amish practices more closely over the past 4 years. Some Amish farms do not just make one batch of weed tea and apply it, they take the finished tea and run it through a second fermentation with a specific additive. Wood ash, not charcoal, not biochar, not commercial potash. Plain hardwood ash from their wood stoves. The ratio is roughly 1 cup of sifted hardwood ash per gallon of finished, strained weed tea. Stir it in thoroughly, cover loosely, and let it sit for an additional 4 to 5 days with daily stirring. What happens during this secondary fermentation is remarkable. The potassium and calcium carbonate in the wood ash react with the organic acids in the tea, buffering the pH toward neutral. The calcium ions flocculate fine clay particles in the tea, making micronutrients more available. And the high potassium content wood ash typically contains 5 to 7% potassium oxide, creates a finished product that is exceptionally balanced across all 3 major nutrients. I had this secondary fermented tea tested at a state university soil lab 2 years ago. The results showed a nitrogen-phosphorus-potassium ratio of roughly 1.55. That is remarkably close to a commercial all-purpose garden fertilizer, and it was made entirely from weeds and fireplace ash. The lab technician asked me where I bought it. When I told him I made it from dandelions and wood ash in a 5-gallon bucket, he did not believe me until I showed him the process. The Amish apply this double-fermented version specifically to their heavy feeding crops, things like corn, potatoes, and pumpkins at the same 1-to-10 dilution ratio. For lighter feeders, the standard single fermentation tea is more than sufficient. This secondary technique is the final piece of a system that eliminates the need for any purchased soil amendment. It is nitrogen from the weeds, phosphorus from the root tissue of deep tap-rooted plants, and potassium from the wood ash, all delivered in a biologically active liquid that your soil can immediately put to work. This is knowledge that was never truly lost. It was simply set aside in favor of convenience and commerce, and the communities that kept practicing it kept growing the healthiest, most productive food in the country, quietly, without fanfare, and without spending a dime. If this changed how you think about what is growing in your yard, I would appreciate it if you shared this with another gardener who could use it. Drop a comment and tell me what weeds you have the most of on your property, because chances are those are the exact ones your soil is asking for. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the kind of thing I dig into every week. That pale, tired dirt you have been fighting with is not broken. It is just hungry. And everything it needs is already growing along your fence line, waiting to be harvested. Go pull some weeds.